when you're in it, you can't see it, right? But once you get a little bit further down the road, you will have that perspective to look back and say, wow, we're not where we were last month or last year or 5 years ago. And so just to keep reminding yourself on really hard days that it is just a video clip and not the entire movie of your life or your child's life.
Welcome to the Honestly Adoption Podcast, the show that gives hope and insight from real voices on the foster and adoption journey. Pull up a chair. We're glad you could join us. Here are your hosts, Mike and Kristen Berry.
Friends, welcome back to the Honestly Adoption Podcast, or welcome. If this is your first time joining us, we're so excited you're here. My name is Mike Berry, along with Kristen Berry, and we are your hosts for this show. We are in Season 20, and this is Episode 165, and in today's episode, we're going to be jumping into, a big topic. Helping us as parents, as caregivers, gain a healthier perspective on the adoption journey. And not only for us, but for the world to gain a healthier perspective on adoption. We're going to be talking to our good friend Karen Springs, author of Adoption from the Rearview Mirror, a book that she just released. We're talking to her about on this topic because she's got some valuable perspectives that she has gained from spending time with hundreds upon hundreds of foster and adoptive families over the years through her work, her advocacy, and her influence. So we're excited to jump into that. We're excited you guys are here. Listen, jump over to our podcast page, especially if you're brand new. Catch up on past episodes, honestlyadoption.com/podcast. And here's the thing. We would absolutely love if you guys would leave us a review. Listen, if you've been listening to us for a while, or at the end of today's episode, if you find, you really enjoyed this show, jump over to honestlyadoption.com/podcast. Scroll down to where you see where our podcast is featured: Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts. Leave us a review, especially over on Apple Podcasts, because it really helps reach more people. So if you enjoy this show, we would love for you guys to do that. We would be super grateful. And guys, you hear us say this a lot, but we really are grateful that you've joined us for this week's episode. We hope you get a lot out of it. And now, here's our interview with Karen.
Well, Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be with you guys.
We are excited to have you here. And we actually just read your book, Adoption Through the Rearview Mirror. Loved it. So before we get started talking about your new book, tell us a little bit about you.
Oh, about me. Well, I'm a person that fell randomly into the world of adoption. It's definitely not something that I ever thought would be a part of my story. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in just a simple, small family. I went to university in Seattle and studied theater and communication and had aspirations to become an actress. But I also had aspirations to travel the world, and I had family that was in ministry in Ukraine, and they opened up a door for me to come visit them. And that was kind of where my adult life really started, and the trajectory of my life really changed. So my relatives at the time were in the process of adopting a boy to add to their family. So this whole world of adoption opened up before me. And then with the work with their organization, I started visiting some orphanages and was just very gripped with the situation in Ukraine. And before I knew it, I was on the road to becoming an adoption advocate. And then as the book goes on beyond that, doing a lot of work in Ukraine, and then now globally doing some advocacy to see children be taken into homes in their own nations whenever that is possible. So that's a bit of my story in a very, very condensed way. But I moved back. So I was in Ukraine for 15 years, and I moved back to the US about a year and a half ago to finish the book and to just kind of consider what God might have for me next.
All right. So the book is called Adoption Through the Rearview Mirror: Learning from Stories of Heartache and Hope. I love that title. And you did something really unique in researching this book and writing it. So you've given us a little bit of your story, but you came back to the United States and you did what?
Yeah, so it was actually during my time in Ukraine, I decided to press pause. It was before I actually moved back. I had been working with adoptive families at that point for about 12 years and was beginning to see that there were challenges, that a lot of people came over with one perspective. And then as the months and years went by, I was either hearing less from families or hearing more of the challenges. And I think that there was this sense, even for myself, I felt like this project was twofold. Part of it was for myself to make sense of what I had seen over the previous 12 years. And the other was to give a voice to the families, because on one hand, we trumpet the beauty and we talk about all the beautiful things, and these families are coming over and we can use rescue language and all of these things. And people go over, they bring a child, they bring the child home, and then we don't really hear what happens. And so I was hearing the challenging stories and felt like, wow, we need to give voice to this challenge so that people don't walk into something blindly, that
Yeah.
we talk about
Mm.
something accurately. And so, anyway, I pushed pause on Ukraine. I came back to the US for 4 months. And I did a road trip across the United States to interview families who had adopted children from Ukraine. And my primary sample group was families that had stayed with me. So for the previous 6 years, I had ran a hospitality ministry out of my home where American families were coming over to adopt children, and they were staying in my home. So I was getting to know these families very up close and personal, hearing their stories. So now it was a reverse. Instead of me hosting them, they would be hosting me as I drove across the United States. So I spent about 4 months, 3, 4 months on the road. And in that time was able to interview 63 different families who had all adopted Ukrainian children and who I had encountered in Ukraine. So they were all anywhere from 1 year home to as many as 8 years home with their children when I interviewed them.
All right, so you used the term rescue language. Will you explain this a little bit more, and how can we change to more healthy language?
Yeah, well, I think, goodness, that language has been around, and I probably even was guilty of using it myself, is right, that these are children, and that term can be used whether it's here in the United States in foster care, or it can be true if it's in Ukraine or anywhere in an orphanage, where it's this idea of child is in a bad place, right? And that might be true. So therefore, I am going to come and rescue this child out. And I think sometimes we equate that as the situation itself, right? As long as I take the child out of the situation, I have succeeded in rescuing that child.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that for one, and in many cases, that could be true. You might be rescuing. I mean, this might be a horrific situation. That could be the case. But in many cases, it isn't. The situation itself might not be horrific. The child might not see themselves in need of rescue. So I think it's language that we can use very broadly, and it's not always true. And I think especially because it's recognizing that the journey of bringing a child into your home, it is a journey. It's not a once and done, I rescue, I bring home. So I don't know, Kristen, what would be a better word. I think I would have a hard time describing a one word replacement for that, but I'm always very hesitant to use that language of rescue, because I think it's not helpful for the parent, because then they become the rescuer. And then it also, the one that is quote unquote rescued, that is a big weight to carry, and to feel like you're indebted to somebody. And I don't think that
Yeah.
any child should feel indebted. So, but yeah, I think that is language that the church has used and society has used,
Yeah.
and we just need to be careful with it.
I really love how you explained that so well. I know that for us as parents, that type of thinking sets us up for failure. When we think we're foster and adoptive parents here in the US, and even then, there's that feeling of, oh, well, if a kid ends up in the foster care system, that's terrible. And so I will fix it. And what becomes the problem with that type of fix it rescuing mentality? It's an expectation that both mom and dad and a child can't live up to. I know that here that is just a common narrative that ends up with then kind of a language of, well, I don't know why the child's not grateful. There's plenty of food here, or something, and really missing the mark
Yeah.
on the complexity of what adoption really is, for sure.
I
Yeah.
think, the one thing that just stands out to me, specifically when it comes to what we're talking about right now, is that this has been that when you go back 18 years in the past, almost 19 years now, when we first started this journey, we started out adopting privately through an agency here in Indianapolis, and the agency didn't, impress it on us that we were rescuers, right? But people that heard that we were adopting immediately just started to hail us like, oh, and we were in a church community at the time. We were working as pastors in a church in Indianapolis, and I remember that you're getting hailed as like this hero. And for me personally, I was in my early 20s or mid 20s at that point. It felt kind of good. It's like, oh yeah, I'm awesome, right? But it's so dangerous to take on that mentality, not just for us, but for our children as well. Because I think that also translates into how we approach our children, and especially when our children don't behave the way that we either understand or that we want them to. And I
Mhm.
think that that's a big problem. If I were poking holes in things, I think that can be a big problem for how the church in particular um, views adoption and almost communicates adoption. Because going back to when we first began, that's where we were at. And so I think that I agree with you, Karen. It's like, yeah, the word, I don't know what to supplement out for rescue. Maybe we just need to
Yeah.
strike it all together, or we may just need to view ourselves. I think we need to view ourselves as we are participating in this child's story. We have a unique
Yeah.
opportunity to, take part in this child's story and share our story with them. And we journey together, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
agree that we were there. That was me. I mean, I fully admit that was me. And I had to have somebody look at me and say, you're not that child's rescuer. You know that, right? I remember a mentor saying that to me, who was a seasoned adoptive parent. And that was really the end of me thinking that. That was my stupid 20s thought
And I think
process.
the families that I interviewed, I'd say that there was both. I would definitely say there were some that probably entered in with the rescue mentality.
Yep.
And then there was others that were like, no, this is what God has called us to. It's obedient. This is the child that God has led us to, and we're going to do this. And they didn't, and they were very quick to say, don't paint us as heroes, don't paint us as this, like we're just doing this thing that we
Yep.
feel called to. So I definitely feel like sometimes it is, like you said, the outsiders looking in. So even if the adoptive parent might not feel like that themselves, society is kind of painting that on them. And so that's where I think we can, change even as the outside community for
Yeah.
adoptive parents, is just seeing them as normal people that are stepping forward in faith to do something that's very important.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So that really leads to the next question that I have, which is you talk about in your book about that inspiration to adopt, and that the call to adopt, particularly within communities of faith. So some of that you actually you cite a couple books within the Christian evangelical community that really prompted a lot of people to say, I'm not going to live this American faith anymore. I'm going to do something. And I love the sentence at the end of the paragraph where you talk about that movement, that inspiration, that wake up call. You said, however, we equally need the voices and giftings of teachers who can inform and equip us for the work at hand. Thank you for saying that. I know that in so many of the people that we talk to, I'm actually an adoptive big sister. My youngest brother was adopted before all those books were written.
Yeah.
But some sense of my parents were watching a television show. I don't know, I don't even know if Dateline existed that, one of those late night news type programs. And they were highlighting orphanages in Romania.
Mhm.
And my parents said, oh my gosh, like we have a 4-bedroom house and 3 kids and a good job and plenty of money, and our kids are fine, and we seem to be doing a pretty good job. We should do something. And so that led my parents 25 years ago to just pick up and do something. But they were not equipped. They came back with, after years of ins and outs and ups and downs and roller coaster, and then, spending a month they ended up in Bulgaria. After spending a month away from their family, now all the 3 of us who are left at home for a month are melting down, and, grandma's had enough of us and all of that. Then they brought home a child who didn't even speak English. And there was obviously the child didn't speak English, but it was like all of the passion to go, and none of the support system, none of the equipment that they needed to really support my brother well. And my parents, thankfully, are the kind of people who keep trying and gathering resources. But I know in the years after, that has been something that my parents have said over and over. If we would have known about
Mhm.
trauma, like obviously we should have known about trauma, but we didn't. We just thought, we have food. It'll be fine. We have other nice kids and they'll all like get along and it'll be great. And from my perspective, I can't imagine a world without my brother. I can't imagine a life without him. But to try to put myself in his shoes and realize that he came into an entire family ill-equipped to be his family. Want to touch on that a little bit. As you began to interview different families, what did you find that would have helped equip them better?
Yeah. Well, you know how, I mean, the saying is like, you don't know what to, or it's like how, what they're saying about like preparing for something until you're in it. Like you don't really know what to prepare for. And I think it's, I haven't had children, but I think for people that are same thing, it's like when they're preparing to have a baby and they read all the books and then they get the baby that the books weren't written for. And so I think that there is a little bit of both. And I found that with some families, like I encountered some families where they did so much research, like they were trauma informed. They had done all the stuff, like from the clinical psychologist perspective, like they were so ready to go. And then like the child comes home and it was like, they suddenly are looking at all the books again and saying like, none of this is working, right? Or none of this seems to fit our child. And so I think it's like a little bit of both. And is that you do want to prepare, but then it's also recognizing is you don't really know, like, because trauma affects kids so differently. I mean, some kids like have higher degrees of resiliency and how they, if their brain is impacted or not impacted. And so I just found that for families that did well in terms of that adaptation process, it was families that had read, they were prepared, but then they were willing to keep preparing and to keep exploring and to, you try one thing, okay, that strategy worked amazing for that family, but that's not working for ours. So we're going to let that one go and we're going to try something else. And so I think being around a community where you have a support system that can give you ideas, but they're also not going to hold to any one idea as, as one mom said, the silver bullet. Like there's no silver bullet, everyone is going to try what works for one kid, it doesn't work for another. And so I found that families that were at least open and wanting that input did really well, and recognizing that they needed that if they were going to thrive as a family.
Definitely. All right. So you also talked about statistics. And I want to pause there a little bit because this is something that Mike and I just didn't even know about until a couple years ago. And that was that some of those statistics that we were using or saying, particularly for us within communities of faith, we would go and speak to a church and they would say, oh, tell everybody the statistics, tell everybody why they should be an adoptive family. Or there was a push within Christian communities. If one person in every church in the United States were to be a foster parent, or something, there would be no foster kids. I don't remember what the phrase was at the time.
It was something along those lines.
Right. And so, and all of those make a lot of sense until you start to dig into what those stories are. We began to find out through some friends of ours that work with, now I just completely lost the name of it, 1 Million Home. Yes. Many children that fall within those statistics actually have a living parent. They are living in an institution, but maybe they've been living there temporarily because mom and dad don't have money to care for them for a while. Often families are lacking resources, not ability to parent. Can you talk a little bit about what happens when statistics are inadvertently misused when encouraging families to adopt, and what we can do to change that and have a more realistic approach to creating permanency that's good for all kids?
Mhm. Well, I think there's two things with numbers and statistics and data is everybody wants data and stats to work for them. We're seeing this, all over the world right now, right? Everybody wants to use data. And I think the thing is that like it's very easy to broad stroke with data, but you miss like underlying nuances of things that are going on. And so I think the global number for orphans is 143 million. You'll see it on a lot of global orphan care things but the reality is that even that number, which is used by UNICEF, is children who have lost one or both parents. So you don't know if it's one, you don't know if it's both, you don't know where that child lives. That's not 143 million in institutional care. That's some kind of loss of parent. So even that number, I remember being at a conference years ago that was like, if 143 million people adopted, and it's like, no, not really, because those aren't kids that need parents. And I think the same thing with the statistics in Ukraine is that, like, yes, how many kids are in orphanages, but how many of them can actually be adopted? And so I think, and I was definitely guilty of using statistics early on to say, we have this number and this number of this, and we can solve this problem, instead of recognizing that there are nuances. And I was talking with a friend of mine, Jody Tucker, who leads Orphan Sunday in the US. And she was even saying, that she's seen how statistics, when they're actually brought a lot smaller, they actually are more effective. Because I also find when numbers are really big, they actually make me want to check out, because I think I can't handle 400,000 kids
Yeah, it's
in the US.
overwhelming.
Yeah, you're like, well, I can't do anything. It's too big. But if you tell, somebody in your community, right, there are 5 families that are at risk, what can you do? Suddenly it's like, oh, wow, in my community, there are 5 families.
Yeah.
We could help one. Or if even if it's global, if your church partners with a church in Rwanda and says, we are partnering with this church, with this orphanage to get those kids into families. So I think anytime you make an issue smaller instead of bigger, you're actually going to have more impact, because it becomes personal and you can actually see the dent made in the problem.
Yeah. I think that to add to that, when you share what good is happening, because I think a lot of times what we do with the statistics is we share those, like, there's 400 million this and it's terrible, and they don't have this, they don't have this. And I agree with you. It's like, that's overwhelming. Like, I realize, what can I do from Central Indiana? I feel powerless, right? I was at a conference years ago, and it wasn't an adoption related conference, but I remember one of the speakers coming out and saying, let me share some good statistics with you. And it was inspiring. It was like, how this amount of children were cared for. And it was, again, it wasn't adoption related, but they were sharing statistics about something completely unrelated to adoption. But I think that people want to be part of something that's inspiring, right? Now I'm cautious with that, because I'm like, I want people to be ready.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want people just to say, oh my gosh, I should join. I should be an adoptive parent. I should be a foster parent, because they may not be equipped for that. Right. But I think that on the same token, people want to hear about change happening, because we live in a world that's so dark and so dismal with so many things, that we're so used to it that I think we do check out, because we're like, this is awful. And I feel like I can't contribute anything. But to hear those smaller statistics, and to hear that there are actionable items that you could do, I think that inspires people. And I think that's what people need to hear, And I will say this too. I don't want to go down a rabbit trail here, but the struggle that I had when I really opened my eyes to the statistics that were being thrown around, like, if one person out of every church in the United States would choose foster care, we would get rid of the foster care system altogether. There were times where I feel like I'm being manipulated into doing something, and I want to be cautious with that, but I also want to speak truthfully from what I felt, like I feel like that can at times cross into spiritual manipulation. So I think we do need to be cautious with how we use those statistics. And like you said, instead of there are these millions of children that don't have forever families. Let's talk about what's happening right here in our neighborhood or right here in our own city.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. And guilt, guilt can be helpful sometimes. I mean, sometimes everybody needs a good little bit of a wake up call in terms of, getting their priorities straight or rethinking about like their life and how they're living it. But you can't, guilt's not going to help you raise a child though. So I think
right,
it's
right.
like, there might be a deeper conscious things that
Yeah.
God puts on your heart to bring you to something. But then I think it's peeling back the layers of, okay, am I, going back to what you said, Kristen, am I equipped? Where am I going to go to get equipped? And, it was one friend, I think I wrote about this in the book, that said she does her best to try to scare everybody out of adoption because she figures if they still go forward and they're not too scared, then they probably should do it, but if the couple stories are going to scare them away, then maybe
Yeah.
this isn't where they should be. So
Well, I like that too, because I think that if you're still determined to do something after you hear how hard things can be, you might also have your heart in the right place. We know that ER doctors are exposed to what's happening in the ER. They don't become an ER doctor because they think that it's about
yeah.
crocheting, or something. I don't know.
Where did you get crocheting from?
I don't know, because I don't
Yeah.
even know. I don't know how to crochet.
Clearly, we know nothing about medical.
I don't know
care at
anything
all.
about being a
Yeah.
doctor or
Nothing.
crocheting. But I mean, you have a lot of experience before you
Yeah.
end up being hired to work in the ER. And so, if you hear, hey, adoption can be really difficult, adoption is really difficult. All children who are adopted have experienced trauma, period. If you can hear that, then you might be at the place where you're able to say, this is still something that
Mhm.
I feel called to do. So I'm going to get equipped. We don't march into the ER and say, I think the Lord called me to the ER. You would not want me to be your ER doctor. But
Right.
you're going to say,
Exactly.
I really, really want to work in the ER. And so you go to school for 7 years and you become a
Yeah.
doctor. And if we're going to become good parents, if we're going to do this well, then we need to hear the truth of what our kids are struggling with, what their perspectives are, where they're coming from, and how we can create an environment that is supportive for them. So I
Yeah.
definitely agree with you. If we can talk truthfully, we're going to weed out, those parents who are, just jumping in, thinking
Yeah.
it'll be fun.
Well, just tailing end on that too. I heard from a woman recently who, in the writing circle of adoption, and she said that a woman who read my book contacted her who hasn't adopted and was saying she's very concerned about adopting now. So that was her take after reading my book, was she was concerned. And it's interesting, and because I've heard from a few people that haven't adopted that they've read my book and they're like, oh, I don't know if I would do that. But for everybody that has read my book that has adopted, they've said, wow, thank you for being so honest, for sharing these really hard stories, because you painted it in such a truthful light. So I'm like, it's so
Right.
funny to hold those two comments in balance, to be like, okay, so people that haven't adopted like want to run after reading my book, and people that
Mhm.
have are like, oh, it's like fresh water. So anyway, it's
Yeah.
just funny
Yeah.
to have those two comments side by side.
Yeah.
I,
Yeah. Oh,
I think you're really
we've had people
right.
say that.
And that's a lot of probably your audience and our audience are very similar in that way, because the truthful conversations need to happen, and they need to happen in a way that it's a careful ground, I guess, because they
Yeah.
need to happen in a way that brings dignity to our children and our families, but also equips us well. And yeah, so I love it. I really enjoyed reading the book, and definitely identified with a lot of the thoughts and feelings that families were having. And as I read it, having had some real honest conversations with my children, who are now all old enough to express their own feelings about being adopted, that has also really shifted our perspective. Where 20 years ago we thought, you know, oh, our friends' kids are coming into the foster care system. Okay, we'll help out, like a bunch of ding dongs with no training or I mean, that really is how we went into it. That's true. We were like, okay, this is fine. But in my mind, you quoted a mom in there who said, you can't just, and I'm going to misquote here, like order up a princess with curly hair who loves pink and wants her nails done or something like that.
Yeah.
And honestly, when I look back at bringing my first child home through the foster care system, I thought, well, her mom and I are friends, so it'll be fine. She'll understand. She'll know it's just for a little bit. I thought it's a little girl. I'm going to buy every sundress that, Carter's has to offer. And what I realized then pretty quickly was that this was a terrified little girl who had no idea why she was moving into my house. And so I think that again, there's just this balance. And as I read your stories, I also began to think of my kids who now as young adults and teenagers are now telling us when we came to this house, it was terrifying.
Mm.
We weren't sure what to expect.
Yeah.
We didn't really want to be here. We wanted to be with our mom. We wanted to be with our grandma. Yeah. And those are hard things to hear, but knowing, as we're growing and learning, it shifts our perspective. And I think you know, if the us of us today could have told us that 20 years ago, we would have done a better job with our kids when they were little, for sure.
Yeah, I have to say too, I'm going to mention this real quick on air so people can hear this. If you're hearing like a humming sound or a pounding sound, it's not you, it's us, because our house is under construction. So, and it's not Karen. Karen is not,
not
her
my
house is
No,
not under construction.
your house is quiet.
But ours is,
Sorry,
and all of a
guys.
sudden I'm like, oh man, we didn't think this through. But that's okay. That is what it is. So hey guys, jumping into this episode real quick to let you know about a really special flash sale we have going on right now with our exclusive training webinar entitled Understanding Trauma, Disruptive Attachment, and How to Manage Disrespectful, Defiant, and Aggressive Behaviors. Right now, you can get this webinar for just $7.95. That's more than 50% off what it's typically offered for. We're offering this at a special sale price because, listen, it's the beginning of a new year. We just got through the holidays. You guys are struggling. It's hard at times to manage some of that dysregulation, those hard behaviors that come out of trauma. Sometimes it's even just hard to make sense of it. Well, in this 4-hour training webinar, we break all of it down for you, walk you through a simple understanding of trauma, show you how trauma has disrupted healthy attachment, and then how to manage those extreme behaviors that you sometimes see with your children. It's all part of this event, and for just $7.95, you get unlimited access to this training. Here's how you get it. You can jump over to the podcast site, honestlyadoption.com/podcast, click the link in the show notes, or simply visit honestlyadoption.com/trauma training. That's all you need to do. Get access to it. It's only available for a few days. And you guys, listen, this webinar simply gives you the tools that you need to parent your children effectively. Don't miss out on this chance to get this super exclusive training webinar for a super exclusive low price, just $7.95. And now, back to the show. I do want to say, we had the privilege of reading your book back in the spring when you released it. Or gosh, was that the late winter? I don't know when we read that to endorse
it was pre-corona.
No, really? Okay. Yeah.
When you read because you read the pre-edited manuscript,
Yes.
I think.
Yeah. We did. And it's an amazing book. And I'll tell you why we love Adoption Through the Rearview Mirror so much is that the adoption and foster care books are a dime a dozen. We know that because we are authors in this market, in this niche, and we are participating in the dime a dozen book. But there are books that you pick them up and you read them and you're like, this is not only a unique perspective on the journey, this is getting beneath the surface of everything that we see, with our own eyes. So with the adoption journey, you walk up to anybody on the street and you say, hey, tell me something about adoption. They're going to tell you something about adoption, right? They may say something that's wildly inappropriate or a little bit off base, but everybody really knows. But people don't know what is just beneath the surface with this journey. And what I mean by that is that the heartache, the heartbreak, the loss that our children experience, and then also through some of the raw and honest stories you tell in the book, um, people don't realize that that's the reality of it. We see adoption in the movies, we see it on television, and it's often tied up with a nice bow, and it's not always accurate. So I love this book because you get beneath the surface of that and tell those real stories, which we're all about because we're the Honestly Adoption Company. So we believe in honest and authenticity. But I also love that you don't just candy coat this for when it comes to like the faith-based approach to adoption, right? You're very honest and real, like talking about the statistics and how we can be off base with that, or some of these skewed perspectives that people have, going back to what we talked about with being a rescuer, right? So, and we have, for those of you listening, we have all of those links to buy the book, included with the show notes. If you're reading this over at honestlyadoption.com/podcast, we have all that there. So I just want to say that it's such a well-written book. You did such a great job. And I do love this. We are all about resources. That's what the Honestly Adoption Company is all about, providing training, support, insights. And that's a passion of yours too. Like wrapping families, wrapping resources around families. And when it comes to finding those resources, or even for those listening right now that may not be a foster parent or an adoptive parent, but they want to support, they want to help, they want to do something. How can they do that? This is kind of a twofold question. All right. So how can families who are actively on this journey as a foster parent or they've adopted find resources, find support? And then how can those who are listening to this, who are like, I want to be active in this. I can't open my home up, but I can do something. So what would you say to those people? That's a big question. Two questions in one.
Okay,
I'll remind you if you need help. If you forget.
So what
okay.
I think for those on the outside, I don't know. It's how it's like when you buy a car, you suddenly notice all those other cars that are the same as yours on the road that you never saw before, if it's the same one, right? Before you'd never seen, I have an Acura, you'd never seen that car before. And so I think it's kind of the same thing as like, once you step into the adoption world, like if you suddenly become aware of people that have adopted or are fostering, but if you're not in it, like if you have no exposure, you're kind of blind and clueless to it. So I think for those that aren't in it, it might be that question of where is the on roads? So does my church have a foster or adoptive ministry might be the first question. And can I attend a meeting or find out how I could be a support or get involved in respite or whatever that looks like, and just have a posture of learning to say, what could I do as somebody who maybe can't take a child in my home right now, but I could cook a meal once a month, or I could take kids once a month, or whatever that might look like. So I think, what is that on roads? And I think, starting with your church, and then if it's not your church, maybe it's another church in your community if your church doesn't have, a program. And I think for those that are I don't know, I always say there's like two types of adoptive foster parents. Is like, there's those that are like, well, equipped and resourced, and they know all the who's who and what's what and who wrote what. And then there's really others. And even some of the families that I interviewed really live on an island of, they've really chosen not to be in adoption communities. They've really wanted to just kind of do things on their own. And so I think it is that question too of, what kind of resources do you need? Do you need support system for your marriage? Do your kids need, a support group? And I think that's the other thing too, is being sensitive. I've been around kids, adopted kids who really want that community of other adoptees. And then I've been around other kids that they really haven't wanted to seek out that. They don't want to be known as the adopted kid. They will figure out other avenues to have those conversations, but being thrust into adoptee communities is not their thing. And I think everyone is different. And so being aware of that. But I mean, your podcast, there's another podcast called Think Orphan that does just some great conversations on
Yeah,
these
yeah.
topics. And I think that they're great on roads for people to be exposed. And I think you guys do such an excellent job of highlighting resources and other writers and thinkers in this sphere to expose families to that. So,
Yeah,
so
thank
keep
you for that.
listening to you guys.
Well, there you go. Yeah. Well, that's the
That's
show,
it.
everybody.
There you
That's
go.
we're gonna wrap it right there. Listen to us. Just
No,
kidding.
that's
Just
the
kidding.
answer. Okay, so as you interviewed those different families, what were some things that families were doing well, particularly in the areas of connecting kids with their culture of origin, helping them develop their identity? Were there any things that stuck out to you as you did those interviews that families were doing well?
Yeah, that also was, I feel that's what I love about what I took on was I was able to hear so many perspectives, because I think when most people write a book, they're writing it from, this is what we did and this was our perspective, right? And then it becomes like the ultimate, like, oh, we want to do what the so-and-sos did. But I think what was so cool for me about this journey is like, I would walk into one home and they did it this way and it worked. And I would walk into another home and they did it this way and it worked. And so it was just constantly navigating that, or it didn't work. But and even with the culture thing, there were some that very much like embraced Ukrainian culture and made weekly trips to the local Russian or Ukrainian store to incorporate food and menu items or cultural events in their community. And then there were others that had hardly touched, anything cultural. And so I think what I saw going well was when that was just an ongoing conversation, where they got to give the child the opportunity. Do you want us to go to the Ukrainian store or not? Do you want to be in touch with relatives? And, with Ukraine, a lot of people do have living relatives, whether that's a sibling or a grandmother, and even sometimes a parent back in Ukraine that they were keeping in touch with. And that was also a dance that parents had to dance of facilitating this relationship with relatives back in their home country. And so I saw families, walking that dance out of when that was a healthy relationship and they could help foster that, or when it was maybe not a helpful relationship and they needed to kind of put boundaries on that if it was, causing harm to their child. So but yeah, I just felt like each family navigated that very, very differently. But it was when they were willing to address it, it seemed to be most positive.
It's so important to keep those lines of communication open and I think flexible. I think that's really important to be willing to talk through those things with our kids. Is this something you want to do? We can do it later if you want to do it a
Yeah.
different time. Do you want to try some Ukrainian food? Try it. They probably grew up eating it. Let's learn how to make that together as a family. Oh, this is too hard for you to do right now. Okay, let's maybe do it another time. Whenever you're ready, we can cook together or something like that. I love the idea of keeping that door open and keeping that conversation open with our children.
Yeah. And like you said, like you just said, it, recognizing it could change, because I've seen some kids that are still very proud of their Ukrainian heritage and where, they're Ukrainian first, right? Well, I'm Ukrainian. But then there's other kids that their goal has been it's been a little bit more distant. Like they want to be seen as an American first, right? And they want to
Mm.
not be known as the Ukrainian. So again, that's just those figuring it out of, are they doing that as a healthy thing or a not healthy thing? And so I think that's like what you said, keeping that conversation open, having those doors if they want to keep in touch, to keep that going. But every kid, I've seen both so clearly, the kid that just embraces everything from their past, and other kids that really want to distance themselves. And so again, I couldn't prescribe one that was more common than the other, even from the families that I encountered.
Right, definitely. All right. So, what is a piece of encouragement you would have for our listeners?
Piece of encouragement. Well, I know that everyone is at a different stage in their journey. And I think that one woman who's a colleague of mine, who has also adopted a bunch of children from Russia. But she always has this saying of saying, remember, you're watching the video clip and not the entire movie. And that really stuck with me, because I think that whenever we're in crisis or we're in that, or joy, whichever it is, like if we're in a high or in a low, we can feel like we're in the middle, like it's the movie, like this is what it is, right? Instead of reminding ourselves like, this is just this is one small part, right? It might be a long chapter, but it's not the entire thing. And I think, I mean, that was my whole heart of having it as rear view perspectives, the adoption through the rear view mirror, is that when you're in it, you can't see it, right? But once you get a little bit further down the road, you will have that perspective to look back and say, wow, we're not where we were last month or last year or 5 years ago. And so just to keep reminding yourself on really hard days that it is just a video clip and not the entire movie of your life or your child's life.
Oh, that's so good.
That's great.
We need that. I'm sitting here as a parent active on this journey and thinking, that's really good. That I needed to hear that personally. Like it's not the whole movie. It's just a clip. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah, I think that works for all of us in whatever season of life we are in, whether
Right.
it's parenting or personal, is that God is still writing this story, and we will see it when we look back.
Or
Absolutely.
COVID-19.
Or COVID-19. Yes, I know.
We need to keep that in mind.
Yes,
Right.
it's just a
Stay
chapter.
the course, parents.
Actually leads us to our final question, which means so much more now that we're all in quarantine. During COVID-19, many of us have been binge watching TV shows or reading or both. So is there anything you're binge watching right now, and what are you reading?
Oh, okay. So I just finished The Crown. So I guess I try to be better and not totally binge. Like I don't usually let myself do more than 2 episodes at a time. But I just finished The Crown. Loved that. Are you guys watching that? No.
Our daughter is.
Okay.
Our daughter is watching it and she's like, Mom, when are you going to catch up and watch all this? And I'm like, I will. I'm binging a different show right now.
So that, and then I am reading, there's a book, and I'm going to get the title of it wrong. It's over there. As Many as the More Than Stars. I'll have to give you the correct title later, but by Robert Glover. He's a colleague of mine from the UK. And it's a book that he just released, but he started an organization in China to place Chinese children in Chinese families, and has done just amazing things throughout China. So anyway, it's kind of his story. And so after knowing him personally and just going through the journey of myself of writing a book, it's been cool to read his backstory of what led him to their amazing pioneering work in China. So I'm a horrible advertiser right now because it's over there. Robert Glover.
Look him up. Look him up. Yeah. Yeah, that's fun. We used to say, well, this was my fault. This wasn't Kristen's fault. But when we would ask this question, we ask this of most of our guests now, the binging and reading question. That's how I would ask it. Like, what are you binging right now? And Kristen finally was like,
every time
you gotta say like binge
drinking?
Watching. Like,
Right.
Yeah.
Why are you asking people stuff?
I know
like
right
that?
now, I know because right now it's like Christmas cookies, right?
Oh, right.
I'm going to grab this name of this book so that I can actually say it
Oh, yeah, definitely.
correctly. Here we go.
Right on.
As Many as the Stars. As Many as the
Nice.
Stars, a story of change for children of China.
Awesome.
Good. Thank you for that recommendation. Well, Karen,
Yeah.
it was just lovely to talk to you. I really enjoyed your book. Thank you for writing it. Love the perspective. And thank you for
Yeah.
taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you both. And thank you for all that you guys bring to this wonderful adoption community, foster community. And I know you guys are an encouragement to many. So thank you.
Well, you guys, thank you once again for joining us for this episode, this amazing interview with our good friend Karen Springs. Listen, if you guys have enjoyed her words, her encouragement, make sure you jump over to the show notes over at honestlyadoption.com/podcast. And we have included links to buy Karen's book visit her main website, follow her on Instagram, and learn more about her. Support her work. She's doing amazing work. She's an amazing human being. We love her to death. We love the book, Adoption Through the Rearview Mirror, and you guys will love it too. Thank you guys for tuning in this week, and we'll see you soon on the Honestly Adoption Podcast.